We were talking in our last lecture about some of the problems the church had right on the eve of the Reformation, and we're going to continue that during this lecture by taking a look at some of the special problems that the different church officials and different levels of clergy had, and then we'll end it up by taking a look at some of the problems in the institutional church. And we talked last time at the end of the lecture about how people were starting to kind of doubt the sacraments and whether the sacraments really worked as channels of grace and to get people to heaven, because of the corruption of priests. And you'll hear in a few minutes a lot more about the specific corruptions of the priests. But another good example besides confession would be the miracle of the Mass, or the ceremony of the Mass, the process known as transubstantiation. According to the Catholic Church, in the Mass, when the priest would speak certain special words, hoc est corpus meum, the bread and wine would be miraculously transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ. And that the miracle of the Mass was really the heart of the church and was considered a kind of re-sacrifice of Christ every time the Mass took place. And it was considered to be a miraculous thing, a miracle. And one of the reasons that priests were considered by the church to be people of special standing and special power was that they could conduct this miracle of the Mass. But people are starting to doubt that too. They're starting to think, well, how can these priests who are so corrupt and sinful actually do such a miracle? Why would God give them the power to pull off the miracle of the Mass? Again, like I said, they're not really saying, I don't think they can, but they're starting to doubt it and wonder how it can happen. And so that's loosening people's bonds to the church with regard to transubstantiation, which of course later on Luther will completely reject. There were other bonds between church and people that were also breaking down, and I just want to mention one other type, which is a more informal type of bond, whereas the sacraments were a very formal kind of process combining the people with the church. Another more informal bond holding the people to the church was the church's obligation or mission to teach people about their religion. Because the average villager, parents really couldn't teach him much about religion, and the average person knew very little about the Christian religion and the church he belonged to, and it was the church's obligation to teach people about the Bible and Christ and the traditions of the church and all that. And the church was really just miserably failing at this teaching mission. People were not getting taught. Why was that? Well, the main reason is that the place where the teaching would have taken place, the most important venue for the teaching, would have been preaching. But in the late medieval church, there was very little preaching, and the preaching that did occur was actually quite poor. And the reason for this was that, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, most priests who would have been doing the preaching, and even many bishops, were not capable of doing it. In the case of priests, a lot of them were illiterate, they were poor speakers, they were even socially kind of awkward, and they just could not get up there and deliver an oral message with any kind of content to the people that were depending on them. So preaching was very poor, very infrequent, and this was a frequent complaint of people who criticized the late medieval church, was that there was not nearly enough preaching. And some towns, some bigger towns, would actually hire specialized priests with special training to come in and just preach in the city because the regular priests weren't doing it. But that was kind of a rare thing, but it just shows you the need for preaching and the lack of preaching that there was. One of the ways the church tried to remedy this situation was by attempting another type of education of the people, and that was the stained glass windows in the church. They thought, well, now if we can, as the people are standing, standing in the nave, listening to the Mass, and maybe not really understanding much of it, I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes, we'll put these big colored windows in the nave, and we'll paint biblical scenes, scenes of biblical stories on the windows. And so when the people gaze up and look at the windows, they'll learn something about the Bible and about the life of Christ, for example, the apostles, and so forth. But the problem with that was the windows, although they're beautiful, very nice, and did illustrate biblical stories to people who knew what the stories were, to the average person who didn't know anything about the Bible or the life of Christ or any of that, the windows were just pictures. They couldn't tell what they were all about. They certainly didn't get the correct message from the pictures. They just didn't have any way to interpret the pictures. And sometimes they would even kind of dream up their own interpretations for the pictures, which people have argued led to heresy and some very bizarre ideas about church teaching. So that effort to teach people through stained glass windows just didn't work. And as a result of all this, the average person just ended up ignorant of the religion. And you can't be particularly pious if you don't know anything about the religion that you're participating in, or you can't be at least very informed and a very devout follower of the religion if you don't understand it. So that was really a very big problem. The failure of the church to teach people about even the basics of religion was a pretty big problem. Well, another big problem, though, was just the corruption of the various church officials, and you find this corruption at every level. So we'll start out at the bottom, at the level of the parish priest, and we'll move our way up by the end of the lecture to the very top of the church, the papacy. The parish priest was, in many ways, the foot soldier of the church. He was there on the front lines, in the village, in the parish church, in contact with the average believer every day. And you'd think that a person who's got that important a job, and who really is the contact point between church and people, would be the one who's most educated and most capable of doing this job. But in fact, just the reverse was true. Most parish priests were not very capable of doing the job they were supposed to do. They couldn't teach the people. They couldn't even lead the people. And basically all of this has to do with who were the priests. I mean, who would be a village priest, a parish priest? Who would take that job? Certainly a noble's not going to take that job. Even a middle-class fellow with money is not going to take a job like that. The people who take these jobs are themselves peasants. So the parish priest is just one of the village peasants who's been chosen to do this job, and he actually is very little different from all the other peasants in the village. He has all the same problems that other peasants in the village have. For example, for the most part, but there are exceptions to this rule, of course, there were exceptions, but for the most part, the parish priest was ignorant. Very few went to any kind of formal schooling. Very few went to universities. That was very, very rare. When you get to the case of Martin Luther, you find something that's very, very rare indeed. Most of the parish priests did not know Latin, which is a problem when you consider that both the Bible and the Mass is written in Latin. And most of them were terrible preachers and terrible teachers. So they were ignorant. They were also poor. Just like all peasants, they were poor. As a matter of fact, they were even poorer than most peasants because when they did their church job, they couldn't be out working in the fields. And so their income was very low. They took up very little in collections from the poor peasants they worked with. They had very little income. And on top of all that, the bishops taxed the priests. So you had to pay taxes to the bishop. So priests were really poor and often, or sometimes at least, resorted to cheating people to make money. Finally, many priests were considered immoral because of the prohibition on clerical marriage, which had been around since the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century. Since the 11th century, no clergyman, priest, bishop, whatever, can be married, supposedly. But these parish priests just didn't have the ability, really, to live without a wife and family, just like all the other peasants in the village probably couldn't have lived without wife and family. So the parish priest kept concubines, essentially wives. They didn't call them wives. They said, well, this is my housekeeper, or this is my maid. But everybody in the village knew that this was his wife. So that was considered quite immoral. And sometimes because they were poor and because they were forced to make money in in underhanded ways, like sometimes they got involved in smuggling and other kinds of things. That also added to the impression that priests were immoral, which was a difficult experience. Now, a lot of this kind of comes to a head in people's experience of the average celebration of the Mass. And I'll just give you one more example of that. When the average villager goes to Mass, he'll go into the church, he'll stand in the nave. Like I said before, there are no pews to sit on. And right in front of him, there's this huge wooden screen called the choir screen, which is made and put there so that the average person can't actually see the Mass being conducted. Behind this huge screen, you have the priests who are there to conduct the Mass, and they're supposed to be reading the Latin Mass, and carrying out the ceremony. But when quite a number of them don't know any Latin, what they're actually doing is a process known at the time as garbling and mumbling. Instead of actually reading the Mass or reciting the Mass, they would simply make nonsense sounds like, and because the people out there in the nave who didn't know Latin either had no clue that wasn't the Mass. So here you have the experience of people in church. They're in this cold, dark place. They're standing up. They can't see anything because of this big screen. And there are all these weird mumbling sounds coming from behind it. Wasn't a very inspiring experience. And it didn't really involve people in a religious life the way people wanted to be involved by this period. And the fact that the priests were so corrupt made peasants doubt whether they could even pull off the Mass anyway. So that was a real problem. Well, when you move on up the ladder, the higher clergy are no better off. So we'll move up and take a look at bishops next. Bishops typically were extremely worldly, political, and corrupt individuals in many cases. And again, it has to do with where they come from. People who took the job of bishop very often were younger sons of nobles. Because in most places in Europe, inheritance law held that if a noble father has a number of sons, the eldest son gets most of the inheritance and the other sons get just small portions of the inheritance. This is a practice that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And of course the problem there is, if you have 12 sons and one gets most of it, then you got 11 others who are going to have very little money, but you got to figure out some way to get them a job where they can make sufficient money to maintain their noble lifestyle and not embarrass the family by, living life as a beggar or something. And a bishop's job was perfect, because a bishop was considered a kind of noble of the church, and the jobs had pretty good incomes attached to them. But as a result of that, the people who took these jobs, the younger sons of nobles, saw the job as essentially an income or a sinecure, and not really as a spiritual duty. And in fact, they didn't feel particularly obligated to perform their spiritual duties. In many cases, they didn't understand them. In many other cases, they didn't really know how to do them. And in other cases, they just didn't care. They just wanted the income from the job. Another factor is that bishops were often very deeply involved politically. And this is especially the case in Germany, where many bishops tended to be secular rulers of small states. And if they were a secular ruler of a small state, they were involved in politics, they were involved in diplomacy, they were involved in warfare, they were involved in everything a ruler would be involved in, and they just didn't have a lot of time left over for their spiritual duties. So, that was additionally a problem. The Bishop of Strasbourg, for example, in 1500, was a Wittelsbach prince from Bavaria who never once preached or heard confession in the 28 years he was bishop. So that's not exactly doing your job. Other